Hi guys, welcome to another Monday night study. Tonight what I wanted to do is go through the Bible and some of the Jewish texts that talk about the red heifer. You may have noticed this last week. There's some excitement with getting, I believe it was 5 or more, a group of red heifers delivered to Israel from Texas. And everyone's excited. Other people have been asking, what's the big deal with it? Because I thought we already had them, or why do we need more, etc. And basically, the answer is when it's time to sacrifice a red heifer, it has to be a certain age, without blemishes, etc. So it can never be ridden. It can't have any cuts, any hairs that are one way or the other. And as you know, we're born with a certain color hair. As we get older, sometimes spots come or hair color changes. I don't know if it's the same with cows, but basically there's just a certain time, and they have to be absolutely perfect. So right now, there is no way to sacrifice the red heifer. So what we want to make sure that happens, if you had a herd of red heifers, then any particular year, you could probably guarantee a perfect sacrifice. And so that's basically what they're trying to do. So we wanted to kind of look at this and kind of see how it works a little bit. And so I wanted to pull up, this is my book, Ancient Messianic Festivals. And we talk a lot about the different prophecies. And so we've got spring festivals, fall festivals, other ceremonies, and then things related to the tribulation period, that kind of stuff. Under other prophecies, we have Hanukkah, new moon festivals, 9th of Av, Purim, red heifer, and the wedding ceremony, how that kind of fits together. So if we go to the red heifer section, so we want to look at the paraduma, and basically the ritual consists of sacrificing a red cow, a heifer. And so here it is. The basic information is from Numbers chapter 19, the first 9 verses. And we'll just read this here. It says, "And the Lord spoke to Moses and to Aaron, saying, This is the ordinance of the law which the Lord has commanded, saying, Speak to the children of Israel, that they bring thee a red heifer without spot, wherein there is no blemish, and upon which never came a yoke. You shall give her to Eleazar the priest, that he may bring her forth without the camp, and one shall slay her before his face." So he's taking her out. Now, later on, we find out this is outside the camp. It's actually on the Mount of Olives where this should take place. And it's really cool because it's in a place where you can look over the valley straight through the eastern gate, or over the eastern gate into the temple, according to Josephus and several other places. This kind of helps us determine where the temple was also, because there's only a certain number of places you could have it on the Mount of Olives, and any of those places going through the eastern gate would be right where the temple would be, just somewhere right here. So it couldn't be way off somewhere else. So anyway, but this is a symbol, of course, for Christ, and we're going to see a couple of things with it. But so far, it's supposed to be a red heifer without spot or blemish, and the rabbis interpret that as not having any hairs, spots, white or black. It's supposed to be perfectly red. And he gives her to Eleazar the priest, takes her outside of the camp over to the Mount of Olives, and one person, one of the priests, will slay her before his face. So he's actually observing the ceremony, making sure it's done right as high priest. Someone else kills her. Then Eleazar the priest will take of her blood, rather, with his finger, and sprinkle of her blood directly before the tabernacle of the congregation 7 times. Now, this is back when they had a tabernacle before the temple. When the temple was created, it's the same basic idea, but it's on the Mount of Olives. Now, between the Mount of Olives and the eastern gate, there is a cemetery, and this has to be clean. If the cow was to walk through a cemetery or anything along those lines, it would become ceremonially unclean. So you can't do that, except you have to kind of do that. So they build a special ramp between the Mount of Olives and the Eastern Gate for this particular purpose. So again, looking at all those facts, we should be able to determine approximately where the temple would be. Let's see here. Okay, so he sprinkles the blood 7 times toward the congregation, and when there's a temple, it will be toward the temple. One of the priests shall burn the heifer in his sight, her skin, her flesh, her blood, with her dung shall be burnt. So it's a whole burnt offering. In other words, it's not like some of the offerings where you get a steak or some other part of the animal to eat for one of the festivals. And the priests don't use it for any food. This is a whole burnt offering. Let's see here. And the priest shall take cedar wood, hyssop, and scarlet, cast it into the midst of the burning of the heifer. And then the priest will wash his clothes, and bathe in his flesh and water, and afterwards he will come into the camp. And the priest shall be unclean until the even. And this is a standard thing when you enter something that's unclean. On a practical side, staying away from people until that evening is a pretty good indication that you didn't catch anything, any kind of disease. We see the same kind of stuff in Numbers when it talks about you're not supposed to eat anything with the blood in it. You're supposed to kill it, bleed it, cook it properly. But if you're out in the wilderness, for instance, and you're starving to death, and you find something that an animal killed, basically roadkill, and you take it and you cook it and you eat it, it's a situation where if you eat it, you might catch something and die. But if you don't eat it, you will die if you're starving. So in a situation like that, you go ahead and do the best you can with it, and then bathe, get any kind of disease that might be off of you. And then if the evening comes and you're still perfectly fine, then you're fine. If you get food poisoning, it's usually within an hour or two, or maybe not even that long. I don't think there's any case of food poisoning where you can eat the thing and then a day or two later, start having symptoms. So one of those things. But this is standard throughout all of this. Incidentally, we have groups like Jehovah's Witnesses today who would say we refuse to eat blood in any way, shape, or form. And because of that, they let their children die if their children need a blood transfusion. So it's a horrible misunderstanding of that passage. And when the passage says, if it's a life-threatening issue, you go ahead and eat it, and then hopefully suffer no consequences. And the punishment is that you have to take a bath and wait until the evening and see if you're okay. But anyway, this is the same thing. In this case, though, it's more ceremonial because it's supposed to be a sacrifice of sin, and there's some cleanness and some uncleanness to it. So if you're handling the ashes or that kind of stuff, you make yourself unclean, so that you have to go through the normal ritual. But notice it's cedar wood, hyssop, and scarlet. Of course, now scarlet thread represents sin. And you'll remember the sacrifice for the Azazel goat, or the scapegoat. That goat is taken outside the city, and a scarlet thread is tied around one of its horns. And when it's thrown off the cliff, if the sacrifice is pleasing to God, anciently they said the scarlet thread would turn white. And then there were other miracles that happened on Yom Kippur if everything was done correctly. So in this case, the cedar wood and the hyssop, we're not absolutely sure what they represent, but it should be something interesting to go through and study. I would like to see all of the rituals like this in printed form if possible. Many of you know that when you look at a Seder, Passover Seder, you can see the Messiah all through it, his death, burial, his resurrection, the coming of the Holy Spirit, all that kind of stuff is in the ritual. So if we had the rituals for all of those festivals, it would be pretty amazing. So, but this is what we have from the Bible for the red heifer. So cedar wood, hyssop, and scarlet, all together, the whole animal, whole burnt offering, completely burned up. Then it says the priest shall wash his clothes, bathe his flesh in water, and afterwards he will come into the camp, and the priest shall be unclean until that evening. He that burns her shall wash his clothes in water, bathe his flesh in water, and shall be unclean unto the evening. So the priest that actually sacrifices, and the priest that actually, let's see here, does the ritual for the with the wood and everything. Okay, so and then it says, and a man that is clean. So this is a third person. So you've got the high priest and the two people doing the sacrifices, but there's another man then that is clean. So it actually takes three people, three priests. I always think that's interesting when you see a group of three, some sort of an idea or a reflection of the Trinity in this. So the sacrifice is being made by three parties and being observed by one. Anyway, a man that is clean shall gather up the ashes of the heifer and lay them up without the camp or outside the camp in a clean place. And it shall be kept for the congregation of the children of Israel. For the water of separation, it is the purification for sin. Now, many of us remember the incident in John chapter 2. And this is when Jesus turns the water into wine. And there's several things about that. Let me keep this here. We'll come right back to it. But let me show you John chapter 2. John is in the New Testament. So let's see here. Okay. So here's the wedding at Cana. And there's several things we can look at this. But it says on the third day there was a marriage in Cana of Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. What's interesting about this is, again, we go back to the Essene calendar. On this first verse, this whole idea of the third day, that's supposed to tell us something. Well, anciently, today, for instance, in America, we have a kind of a tradition, loosely done. When you get married, there's usually a June wedding, and there's all sorts of little traditions, the white and the something old, something new, something borrowed, something blue, all those kind of things. Now, those are kind of made up as we go along, but we have this kind of a concept of a June wedding. Well, anciently, it was connected with the festival of new wine. Certain things that you could do with a wedding that you couldn't do other times. And the festival of new wine is on the 3rd of Av, according to the Dead Sea Scrolls. So what's really interesting to me is on the festival of new wine, when a lot of people would get married, there was a marriage in Cana of Galilee on the third day. That's got to be what we're talking about. And Jesus ends up turning the water into wine on the festival of new wine. So there's a lot of information there that they knew instinctively what this meant. We don't know a whole lot of the festival of new wine, or we could probably tell you exactly why he turned water into wine specifically. Now, they needed it. They ran out of wine. And you need wine for communion, for other rituals, and for weddings. And they shouldn't have ran out of it. But drunkenness is a sin, but drinking wine is not. It's commanded according to some of these rituals. We don't have to do them because we're not Jewish, but we have to understand what they are to get the whole picture, especially if it has something to do with prophecy. So he's on the third day, he's on the festival of new wine, which is always on a Sunday. So it's a Sunday wedding. It's a wedding in Cana of Galilee. The mother of Jesus was there. And it goes on down, and she said, Jesus was called and his disciples to the marriage. And when they wanted wine, the mother of Jesus said to them, they have no wine. So they ran out. So Jesus said to her, woman, what have I to do with thee? My hour is not yet come. His mother told the servants, whatever he says, do it. So I think this is pretty cool. He's like, it's not yet my time. I really shouldn't be doing anything yet. And then mom just says, whatever he says, do it. It's kind of an interesting relationship, mother and son. But anyway, so she says this, and now notice this next verse, 6. There were set there 6 water pots of stone, not just any stone water pot, but it says it was after the manner of the purifying of the Jews, containing 2 or 3 firkins apiece. So these are water pots, not just for water or water for drinking, but these are water pots that you would use to ritually clean things with water that has been purified. Now we'll see later, and what we did see right there, the ashes of the red heifer, a small amount of the ashes are sprinkled into, on a certain festival, onto water, and this water becomes holy water, or water that's used in a temple for ritual cleaning. So if these pots, these stone pots, were made after the manner of the purifying of the Jews, they contain the holy water. Okay, so in other words, and the holy water is made with water and the ashes of the red heifer. There's other rituals where they combine wine and water. And so there's a lot of rituals. Again, I wish we had the full text of what they did with it, what they said, what scriptures they quoted during the ritual. And we have some of that, but we need a little bit more. But anyway, it goes on. And so these 6 water pots were purification. So then he says, take the water pots. They were empty, but they were that kind of water pot. Fill them with water, and they filled them to the brim. And he said to them, draw out and bear it to the governor of the feast, and they bear it. The ruler of the feast tasted the water that was then wine, and he knew not whence it was. Both servants drew the water, they knew. And the governor of the feast called the bridegroom and said to him, every man begins in the beginning, does set forth the good wine, and after men have well drunk, then that which is worst, but you have kept the good wine until now. And then the rest of the story about the festivals going on. So in other words, normally you set out the really good stuff, and then when people are they've eaten and they've drunk, and if they want a little more food or a little more wine or whatever, and you have the cheap stuff left over, there's a good chance people won't notice that you've went from the really expensive stuff to the cheap stuff. So in this, we're seeing Jesus turns water into wine, not just any cheap kind of, thing, but the really, really good stuff, the way it was done. I don't know how they did it, special spices or whatever, but it was the really, really good stuff. But you can see this. Now, if in the ritual, you take the ashes from the red heifer and sprinkle them on the water, and the water becomes holy water, which can cleanse, then at this wedding, which is the wedding which is on the Feast of Wine, Jesus, by himself, he doesn't take any ashes or anything. By himself, he simply changes water to wine. Not just any wine, but the really good stuff. So what we're seeing here is a missing ingredient, which is the ashes of the red heifer, which obviously points to Jesus the Messiah, or he wouldn't have been able to do it. So in other words, this particular place shows that he is the red heifer. So whatever the red heifer is supposed to be, whatever it's supposed to be, how it's supposed to work, somehow points to Christ. Now we know all the rituals point to Christ, but it's just interesting to kind of see this. So these are the waters for the purification. Okay, and so back down here, notice this again, it ends by saying, the man takes the ashes of the red heifer, lays them without the camp, out in a special place, in a clean place, so they can't be contaminated, ritually anyway. And it shall be kept for the congregation of the children of Israel for a water of separation. This is purification for sin. So in other words, it's the water of purification. So we tie those together, and you know that the ashes of the red heifer are used for ceremonial cleansing of sin. The Messiah is our salvation, and he cleanses us of sin. But let's go ahead. That's what we know from the scriptures. Let's go ahead and add some of the stuff from the Jews. Now, I've come to realize that a lot of the stuff in the Talmud, the traditions, are probably accurate. Some of it is not, especially with the fact that it's written by people who rejected the Messiah. So you got to take it with some grain of salt. Since we've got the Dead Sea Scrolls now, we can corroborate some of those things are absolutely right. As far as what the Essenes taught and what Pharisees and Sadducees taught, they all believe the same thing on certain issues. But then if you're following the Dead Sea Scrolls, you'll see that certain things are absolutely wrong. So that makes me, even more than I used to be, a little suspect of the Talmud. But it's still something that we go to when we don't have any other information to see if we can figure something out. And then if you use the church fathers on how they interpret it, sometimes they'll have a slightly different interpretation or tell you it was done almost the same way but slightly different, which might just be the way they did it in their time, or maybe that's the key to a prophecy. So that's why we want to pull all these together. So that's Numbers chapter 19. Okay, so now here are the details of the ritual given in the Mishnah, Para Adama, so the red heifer. It's in chapter 3 of Para Adama. So the Mishnah is the original oral Torah, so to speak, or what Jesus called the tradition of the elders. And it was put together around 200 AD. And it's the basic Bible. Think of it as like a Bible is a Bible, and then a study Bible has all the extra study notes to it. So a study Bible might actually be twice as big if you've got a whole lot of commentary on the Bible, especially like where Jerusalem is and, you know, what they did with wine or whatever. So in this case, you've got the Mishnah, which is the heart of the whole thing, and then you've got the other part, which is the commentary. Now, the Mishnah was done about 200 AD, again, from unbelieving Jews. The commentary on it, which makes up the Babylonian Talmud, the Mishnah, and then the commentary, it goes from being basically one or two books to being close to 40 books. So the commentary is really crazy on that. To compare myself, when I did the book of Gad the Seer, the actual text, if you just take the text of Gad the Seer in my kind of book, which is 5.5 by 8.5, it's about 40 pages. And then I added my commentary to it. Now it's 140 pages. So kind of like that. We all tend to talk too much. But so this is from the Mishnah, so it's the older part. And again, the Mishnah is 200. The commentary is written between 400 and 800. So again, it's centuries after the fact from people that don't believe in the Messiah. But still, might have interesting things to it. So here's the requirements according to Para Adama 3. The red heifer must be without blemish, which means it can't have one hair that's either white or black. She can't have even one root of hair that's not red. It has to be absolutely perfect. And again, that would be almost impossible if you're trying one heifer at a time. But if you had a herd of red Angus or red, you know, the whole herd is red, a lot of them are going to have blemishes, but surely one or two or three of them, if you have several hundred head of cattle, would be able to be sacrificed. So not one hair white or black, and not one that's red. I thought this was interesting too. Remember in the scriptures, Jesus said, "Why do you swear by heaven, by earth, by this, by that? Why do you swear by your head? Because by your word you can't turn one hair white or black." Wonder if that's got something to do with rituals, or if he was hinting at the ritual. She must be a red Angus that is red from one end to the other, even the skin, the nose, and the skin on the nose and the skin around the eyes. Everything has to be perfectly red. So again, in a herd, you should be able to find one or two of these. She can't have had one blemish, wart, mole, scratch, or scar of any kind. So if it falls down, falls over, gets a scratch, it's not qualified. And we can kind of see the reason for this. It has to be an absolutely perfect sacrifice. Now, this is ritual, So it doesn't make a whole lot of difference, but it points to Messiah. The Messiah has to be an absolutely sinless, perfect sacrifice, or we're not forgiven of our sins. So we understand Jesus is the Messiah. He's 100% God. He's 100% man. He lived a totally sinless life and died in our place. And that's why we have salvation. She can never have had a broken bone. Remember the prophecy in Psalms that talks about the Messiah? He feels his bones. Every single one of them seems like they're out of joint, the pain that he's going through. But the prophecy is that not one single bone would be broken. And normally, when you're hanging on a cross and it's getting toward dusk time and they want to hurry up the death so they can get done with their shift, they'll just come along and break the legs because you get a kind of pneumonia, really hard to breathe. So if the guys come along and break the two legs, you won't be able to push yourself up and you'll suffocate pretty quickly after that. And so that's the standard. So you'd think, Jesus being crucified, he'd have two bones broken. But the text says that the prophecy says not one bone would be broken. And sure enough, for whatever reason, instead of breaking his bones, they see that he's dead or they think he's dead. So you could pass it on by. But to be on the safe side, the one centurion takes the spear and pierces the side of Christ. And then we see outflowing blood and water, which again is an interesting point. But anyway, point being, no bone was broken. And in this case, with a red heifer, you can't have a bone that's ever been broken. No yoke, mains, plow, rope, or blanket can be placed upon it. No one can have ridden her, because that means you're a beast of burden. You're doing normal, everyday, mundane things. And this is supposed to be holy and set apart. So it can't have ever had a problem like that or done any work. Okay. She must be 3 years old, and that's by Jewish chronology, which basically starts at conception. So they say 3 years old. We would say 2 years old, as far as the same kind of a deal. And I know it doesn't say it in here, but it says something along the lines of there's a window. I mean, because you can't have it, 10 years old. Or even if you could, I mean, most likely in 10 years, there's going to be a scratch or a change in hair color or something. So you want it to be 2 years old and as quickly as possible before there's any kind of a blemish to be sacrificed. Okay, so she must be 3 years old, two by our standards. At 2 years old, the heifer would weigh about 1,200 pounds. And this comes into play a little bit later. Most of you are saying, like, yeah, it's about like a 2-year-old cow. But just remember that. We'll come back to that. Okay. So when she is slaughtered, she must be outside the camp because the death, she's taking on the sin, right? It's a sin sacrifice, what it says or pertains to sin and ritual holiness according to Numbers 19. So that's outside the camp. So it has to be outside of Jerusalem. Jesus was crucified outside the city. So a lot of parallels there. In this case, she's to be slaughtered outside the city, but looking directly into the holy place, able to see the veil of the temple. So she must be directly east of the temple. So if this part is correct, again, this is why the place of slaughter is outside the city, outside the camp, which is over on the Mount of Olives, and at a certain place that's designed for it. So in this place, if you were looking straight east, you should be able to look straight east, look into or over the eastern gate, and then up straight into the temple. And so the temple would be right there. We're looking straight east. And if the doors are open, I should be able to see, and the light's right, I should be able to see all the way back into the middle of the temple, the veil. So again, this helps us understand where the temple would be, because there has to be a direct line between where the temple sat over the eastern gate to some place on the Mount of Olives. So there's a little bit of give and take there. but it can't be way over somewhere else. Okay. And then the next part of it says the red heifer can't touch anything that's unclean, like a bone or a grave. Now, you know there's a grave between the eastern gate and the Mount of Olives. And the heifer has to be taken out there. And then the ashes and stuff has to be brought back. So there was a special bridge that was designed for this. So the heifer would not be walking over the graves and possibly touch a bone or something impure. So really interesting. So again, straight line, special bridge. So, okay, so a special bridge was built for her to cross from the temple through the eastern gate over the Kidron Valley, which is also called the Valley of Death, where the dead are buried, to the Mount of Olives, which is also called the Mountain of the Messiah, where a special mikvah or baptismal and altar was built specifically for her. Now, again, ritual cleansing for baptism. And again, I'd like to see the entire ritual for this. So it would be really interesting. I'm sure they just didn't walk over there, cut its throat, throw some stuff on it, burn it up, and then go home in a hurry. I'm sure there was rituals, scriptures that were quoted, things like that. Okay, the wood from the sacrifice is made up of cedar, pine, cypress, and pieces of smooth fig wood. I'm not sure why each piece, but that's the requirement from the Mishnah. Now, there have been 9 red heifer sacrifices in the last 3,500 years. So they need one more. Some of the people have said they would need at least a little bit of the ashes of the last one to mix with this other one to make it holy. I don't know if that's correct or not. If that's correct, I can see the symbolism being the fact that it's an eternal sacrifice. You know, it basically started 3,500 years ago and continues. You just add more to it. The next one will be the 10th red heifer sacrifice. Now, the Talmud in other places says that the 10th and last heifer will be prepared by the Messiah. I think that the 10th one was the Messiah. Now, there may be another one, but again, I don't think it's the Messiah doing it this time, because when Jesus comes back, you know, he may do some rituals like that, but we'll have to see. Whether it's true or not, it shows a belief that the 10th red heifer is the total for all time. So we're ending that ritual, because those ashes can't go forever. So the 10th one, we can see the coming of the Messiah draws near. Now, there's several miracles that happen, so it's supposed to happen when you're doing the ritual for the red heifer. Now, this is what I thought was really interesting. When the sacrifice begins, several miracles happen, and that shows that God is pleased with the sacrifice. Number one, only one priest will gently pick her up and lay her on the altar. Now, remember we said a minute ago, a 2-year-old heifer is about 1,200 pounds. She can't have blemishes or be strange in any way, so she can't be super skinny. Do you know very many priests or as single individuals, even weightlifters, that could pick up a 1,200-pound cow and gently set it on an altar? One person. That would be a miracle. There's no way a human could do that. But supposedly, it's what happens. Second miracles, when she's burned, there will be no smell, no flies, no buzzards or vultures coming around because of the sacrifice. It's completely perfect in some way. Smoke will be white. Usually white is not what comes up when you're barbecuing. So that's kind of interesting. The smoke will be white and go straight up to God, no matter which direction the breeze is blowing or how much of a breeze there was. So even if you got this major 10, 20, 30 mile an hour wind, the smoke just goes straight up. So those are the things supposed to happen when you sacrifice a red heifer and it's pleasing to God. So then the priest will slit the throat of the red heifer, catch the blood in a special container called a mizrach. It's that I used to have a picture of it, but it's a pointed thing. Basically, you catch sacrificial blood and then you take it to sprinkle or whatever you do with that particular sacrifice. But it's pointed because you don't want to set it down and leave it. So they made the vessel pointed to where you couldn't do that because you have to hurry up before the blood coagulates. So then he sprinkles the blood 7 times towards the temple. The carcass will be set afire. When it bursts open, the priest will take hyssop, cedar wood, which is a type of redwood, scarlet wool, and place them inside the opening of the heifer. When it's completely burned to ashes, another priest will collect the ashes with a special shovel created only for that purpose and then place the ashes in a special clay container. These ashes were then added to the mayim hayim, that's the living water, to create the water of purification. So there's the ritual for to take the living water, and that's from the spring. They have started recreating those rituals. So the ritual of the mayim hayim, for instance, um, and a couple of others have not been actually done in 1800 years. But over the last 5 or 6 years, you've been able to see them. If you go to the Temple Institute or their Facebook page, you can actually see some of these rituals going on. Now, they're calling them practice sacrifices and practice rituals because there is no temple, so it doesn't really count, so to speak. But the fact that it's not just that they have the priesthood back, they have all the vessels that they need to do, they're actually practicing the rituals. So not on the Temple Mount, of course, but that will be sometime. So the ashes are added to create the water of purification, and they're put in jar, and that's what we saw in John chapter 2. Jesus used some of these purification jars to turn the water to wine at the wedding. So again, there's a direct connection there somehow. So the red heifer sacrifice might give us a picture of the Messiah standing on the Mount of Olives when he returns. The mountain split in two, possibly creating a bridge so that he can cross over the temple. So that may or may not be the case. That was just my ideas. And then this is from Zechariah 14. His feet will stand on that day on the Mount of Olives, which is before Jerusalem on the east. And the Mount of Olives will cleave in the midst thereof toward the east and toward the west. And there shall be a very great valley, and half of the mountain shall move to the north and half to the west. So it's a really interesting thing, and that's probably connected with this too, something that eventually happens. But I just wanted to share this with you. That's our teaching on that. So we have it from Numbers chapter 9, and it's connected with John chapter 2. And then that's from the Mishnah, which is the Talmud, the extra stuff. So it would be interesting for us to see if they do a sacrifice for the red heifer, and if we're here to see that, and that takes place, if one priest can pick it up, if the white smoke appears, only white, and it goes straight up. I mean, you can look, if it's being televised, you can look around at the trees and other things, and you can tell if there's a wind or not, especially if there's a pretty good one. And then if that's going straight up, it'll be really interesting to kind of see. Since they've rejected the Messiah, I don't know that any of that would actually take place. So who knows? But I wanted to go over that because, again, some people have said, what's the big deal with this? Well, the big deal is it has to be 2 years old and as quickly as you can after 2 years old, because it has to stay perfect. The longer you let it live, the more likely it's going to get corrupted somehow. So you can't just take one of them that came from the herd, for instance, or however many came from Texas to Israel. None of them would qualify because of their age, because of other stuff. But if you have a herd of red heifers, then most likely any year when this actually starts, they would be able to find a perfect red heifer and do the sacrifice. So all of this simply means we're not quite there yet, but we're getting closer. Every time we turn around, something's happened to make us a little bit closer to the way the prophecies share. So at this point, I will go to the chat room and just see what kind of questions we might have on this. First question is, move this to here just a little bit. Do they dress out the heifer or leave everything inside? According to that, they leave everything inside. And then when it should split open somewhere around the line because of the barbecuing. And that's when they put the hyssop and the cedar and the other things in it. Now, the festival of wine was in the fall after the harvest. Missed it when, okay. The festival, let me just bring that up real quick. So here is our DSS calendar. And you can go to Bible Facts, just click on calendar, but either way. So in the calendar section, you can just click on any of these to get the year's calendar. So for this year, this is 2022. So the year begins the day after the Tekufa. So that would have been March 23rd of this year. And so if we go on down, there's always the 4 first fruits festivals are always on Sunday, according to this calendar. So you've got Pentecost Sunday, which is 50 days after first fruits. Well, I missed first fruits up here, but first fruits of the barley harvest, Pentecost, and then 50 days later is first fruits of new wine. And then 50 days later is new oil. And then that begins the week of the wood offering. And then there's simply a 2-day break, and we begin, or a 3-day break, I guess. We begin the high holy days. So on their calendar, the first fruits of new wine, like this year, was July 24th. So it's always 2 weeks before midsummer. And the actual date of the equinox is, who knows, it's a random day. But they always start their year on the Wednesday closest to the spring equinox. So that keeps the Sabbaths in order. So you just keep going, and you lose a day or two every single year until you have enough to make a leap week. So then the Sabbath cycles are all together. Very, very important on this calendar that you keep the 7-day cycle properly. You don't have to take the day off necessarily or do any rituals. Originally, there weren't any rituals, but the calendar is what sets everything apart. And in Genesis, when it talks about God created the 7th day and sanctified it and made it holy, and we're to set it apart, it means to follow the calendar process, right? So anyway, first fruits of new wine would be, as you can see here, the 3rd. So it was on the 3rd of Av, Festival of New Wine. There was a wedding in Canaan when it took place. Okay, and what is the significance of Jesus folding the linen after he was resurrected in the tomb? I think number one, and there might be many reasons for it, but one at least is they would put the linen piece. It's just like a big piece like this that goes over your face, and then they would wrap you basically like a mummy. So you have the outer shell. They would put herbs and spices in it so it would harden. So in other words, somebody could steal the body, but you could always break in and steal a body, in other words. But if there's a body and then this cocoon type thing, and then in between the two is the face wrap. Now, if the body's gone, you could put a fake cocoon or something in there. But if the body's gone and there is a face wrap that has been folded and neatly set on the table or on, bench or whatever's in there, how did that happen? How could how could anybody have taken that out if it's underneath the wrap, in other words? So it's an indication that Jesus came out of that, took it off, folded it, set it down, and left. There's really no other explanation for it. It has to come from inside the grave clothes, which means the person that was dead is now up walking around. I think that's what we're talking about. Now, there are legends of this. Now, supposedly the Shroud of Turin is part of the outer covering. And there is another one that's in some other place in Italy. It's supposed to be the face of Christ. Whether those are or not, is debatable, but it's interesting to kind of see that. How did Jesus not have a broken bone with the nails? I've heard different theories about the holes being in the wrist instead of the palms. Yeah, supposedly it would have been in the wrists. And I suppose you could break a bone doing that, but it would probably separate. But they always said that if you put get right here, if you put a nail, like in the movies, we always see it right here. But if you put a nail through here and then put my weight on it, there's no bones across here, just ligaments. The nail would pull straight out this way. So nailing somebody like this wouldn't hold them up. But putting them through the wrist somewhere, or even like, we're probably not there, but like here, we've got two bones. I'm doing it again. We've got the two bones. So anything around in here, if you went through here, it would go through the two bones. So that's probably how they nailed him. Either way, the prophecy was that no bone would be broken. And then at the crucifixion, I think it's in Matthew, it says that, the prophecy of the bones not being broken, and then gives you more details about it. Good question, though. In the traditional Apocrypha, what can be trusted? I read Baal and the Dragon, and it didn't line up with what really happened to Daniel, as explained in the book of Daniel. Well, something like that may or may not have happened. Some of the church fathers talk about Susanna, which is another part of Daniel, that's part of the Apocrypha. And I can definitely see that happening with Daniel. But we always have these extra biblical things or other histories, may or may not have prophecy or anything like that. But what we've done is we have the received text, what's been handed down to us. And so that's the Protestant 66 books in the form that they are. Now, there's other forms where maybe a book has an extra chapter or something like that, or an extra paragraph. That happens occasionally. That may be true, or it may not be true, or it might be partially true. We don't know. The only thing that we take as a rule and guide of faith is the 66 books of the Protestant canon. And everybody would agree with us, even Catholics. They'd say, well, we also accept the Apocrypha, but they definitely accept the 66 the way we have them, at least. And so that's in each case. Each one of the Eastern Orthodox churches has an extra book or two different. So it's an interesting study to look at the canon and see some of those things. So how far can they be trusted? I think they seem to be pretty legitimate as far as history. The Greek versions have mistakes in them. Like, for instance, in the book of Judith, it's talking about when the Assyrians came down and took the 10 tribes. But then it mentions King Nebuchadnezzar. Well, King Nebuchadnezzar is the Babylonians, a century or so later. Over a century later. So in this case, it's got to be a typo, or someone put it in, or someone tried to make it look weird or whatever. So there's typos or scribal errors in those things. And so that's some of the things that we look at. Now, as far as the Dead Sea Scrolls, pieces of Sirach and Tobit, actually all of Tobit has been found, and then other pieces of those things. We don't even have a whole copy of Daniel. So I don't know that we have any of Susanna or anything like that. But it's interesting to note some of the major arguments on the Protestant side for not including the Apocrypha is that they appear in Greek, but there never has been a Hebrew version, which there should be one. It should have been written by Hebrews in Hebrew. And that's never been the case until the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now we have at least fragments of several of those. So that argument is a moot point anymore. It's irrelevant. So we need to go back and look at that. But we also have a Dead Sea Scroll, um, the Ezra Apocalypse, mentioned by several of the guys. It's supposed to be an extra biblical apocalypse written by Ezra the prophet. In a section of it, it talks about how, under inspiration of the Holy Spirit, Ezra closed the canon. So the Old Testament canon proper is supposed to be the 39 books as we have them. Now, the Jews have the same amount, they just number them differently. Like we have 12 minor prophets, they have a book called the 12. So if you could number them 1 or number them 12, and it changes the numbers, but everything's really the same. And they don't have those things. That doesn't mean that the stories in the Apocrypha are not true, but we don't want to build a doctrine on them because they may not be true. And so that's as far as we go with it. As far as Bel and the Dragon, I mean, there always have been stories of large large lizards that people have used for things like that. Think of a Komodo dragon. Those things can be, the front part as they stand up can be 6 foot. So the front part can be as tall as a man, and then you've got the other part coming out twice as long. Those things can run slightly faster, or at least sprint, and catch a guy. The amount of germs and bacteria in their mouth make it so deadly. It's like when a cobra spits at you, you need to get something like within 10 minutes or you're dead. The Gila monster, Komodo dragons, things like that, they have stuff in their mouths that if you get bit, you're pretty much just dead. So anything like that would make a very good guard dog, so to speak. So there have been many cases where people have used lizards and other creatures, lions and things like that, to protect things. So when it calls it a dragon, the word dragon is just the old word for dinosaur. Dinosaur was a word that was termed by one of the guys that found like a certain type of dinosaur. It just means terrible lizard. And that was in the 1800s sometime. But before then, they were just all called dragons. Today, when we think of a dragon, we're thinking of a flying reptilian creature that spits fire, which is not far-fetched either. We have insects that do the same thing. Some of the insects, like I think there's a bombardier beetle, it has one chemical in a sac in its mouth and another chemical over here, and it spits. And so when it spits, it's good enough to make these two connect wherever it wants it to be. So when it spits just right, they hit here, and then there's a burst of fire because of the chemicals. That could very easily be the way a dragon did it if dragons existed and did that kind of thing. And it seems to be common knowledge from all the ancients. So anyway, there could very easily be something like that. And they kind of show Daniel's wisdom. So in Susanna, for instance, the whole idea is that these priests said that this lady propositioned them, so she should be put to death for being a loose woman. And the answer is you take the woman one place, one priest over here, another priest over here, you question them all separately. And if the two priests have the same story, it's probably real. If the two priests can't come up with the same story, then they made it up. And that's what happened. Neither priest had the same story. So they knew that they were lying and this was an innocent woman. You see the same kind of thing like with Solomon, when they came in and they had one child with two mothers and they both wanted it. Solomon said, easy, just take a sword, get somebody in here, cut the kid in half, give you half and you half. Problem solved. You know, and you think this is a 12-year-old kid, right? You're thinking, kid's nuts, you know. But the real mother said, no, forget it. She can have the child. And the other mother said, no, cut it in half. Well, you can tell which one's the real mother at that point. So Solomon commanded the baby to be given to the proper mother, and everybody was amazed at his wisdom. So it's just manipulating people like that to get them to tell the truth. So there's a lot of things like that in a lot of other books too. There's not much as far as prophecy in the Apocrypha, the Roman Catholic Apocrypha. Actually, there's none. But the Anglican Apocrypha, the Anglicans have the Apocrypha that the Catholics do. And then they also have the Ezra Apocalypse. So if you get a King James 1611, you're going to have the Ezra Apocalypse. And that's the one that talks about the Old Testament should be sealed at 39 books. So that's one reason why the Protestants, or the Anglicans, I should say, the Anglicans who believe the apocryphal books would say the apocryphal book should not be included in the canon. You shouldn't include them in the New Testament either. They're separate groups. So how much they are, even if they were 100% accurate, they may be corrupted now over time. I would trust a Dead Sea Scroll version over the Greek version, but like other Dead Sea Scrolls, they're very, very fragmented. I read heifers are genetically modified to do it man's way. Could the sacrifices of these be abomination? Yeah, possibly. I hadn't heard anything like that. Generally, anything that's genetically modified would be forbidden in Scripture. The whole concept, anciently, we would call that Nephilim technology. The whole idea of trying to mix species or change the genetic code is something that God forbid. So if they did that, then yeah, I can see that being an abomination. Yeah, so Jesus is, the perfect, or the red heifer is the picture of the Messiah. So it's a picture of what Jesus did. If they sacrificed the red heifer now, I doubt those miracles would occur because the true red heifer's already died. What would the priests do? I don't know. It's interesting I don't know if they'd say, well, it's not acceptable, we'll have to do it again, or I don't know what they would do. See, the priests we have now, I don't know that they're actual Zadok priests. And even if they are, or even if they're not, I don't think they accept the Messiah. So the whole problem with that, you see that according to the scrolls throughout all of the Old Testament, is at the times when Israel accepted the Messiah and believed in the Messiah like we do, then they were walking in God's grace, and they were symbolized as a olive tree. The times that they walk in apostasy, they're symbolized as a fig tree. So it's really interesting to see all those things. So yeah, if you have a priesthood that's not doing it right, it wouldn't be acceptable. And we've already had our Messiah anyway. So it's an interesting thing, but we're not saying that God wants the temple rebuilt now. There's just a prophecy that the Jews will build the temple now or sometime, if that makes sense. There's a prophecy that the Jews come back into Israel. Maybe that's God's will, maybe it's not. The concept of a prophecy is just telling you what's going to happen, whether that's good or bad. So if it's prophesied to happen, it will happen. So there will be a temple. They most likely will follow the Talmudic law, which means there will be a red heifer of some sort. The main thing we want to take away from it is what the red heifer symbolizes and see how it points back to Christ. If the Messiah is to be one who sacrifices the 10th red heifer, could that possibly be the false Messiah who the Jews will accept? Very possible. I don't know if Jesus would actually do that when he comes back because it's a different age. Maybe, maybe not, but I can definitely see a false Messiah doing something like this. Matter of fact, remember it said that maybe it's the false prophet, but either way, Antichrist or false prophet calls fire down in the sight of men. Instead of calling fire down to destroy men or commanding a nuclear strike or something like that, what if he commands fire to come down and it consumes a red heifer? It's kind of interesting. Something like that's going to happen. So it would be interesting to see, although I don't really want to be here when the Antichrist is here. That's a good question. All these things kind of come to light. That's why I think it's good to study these things a little bit and to see, even if this is totally wrong, if that's what the Jews are expecting, then that might be what happens. And so, just to see things from all sorts of different angles. Does the temple have to be built first so that it can be consecrated following the ritual, or does the ritual consecrate the site to allow the temple to be built? I don't know for sure. That's a good question. I would assume that they would have to have a red heifer to do the water purification to do the temple. So I would assume that would be first. The question, I guess, at that point would be, do we have anywhere any of the ashes of the old heifer? It'd be 2,000 years old or thereabouts, but sealed in a jar, maybe. So could you use just a little bit of that to make purification water to dedicate the temple, then use the temple and its purity to make a red heifer sacrifice? So maybe it's both. It's hard to tell though. But I would assume if we don't have anything from the last heifer, that it would have to be the heifer first and then the temple. That'd be my guess. I heard that they were flown in on a Boeing 777. Okay. Is this true, and does it have a significance? I don't know. I hadn't heard that, but yeah, I don't know for sure. Is the third temple that will be built the same as the one Ezekiel saw in the vision? Probably not. That's the millennial temple that he sees. So if they build a temple or have a tabernacle or whatever they do on the Temple Mount, it says that the temple would be rebuilt. So I'm assuming it's a temple, and the Antichrist desecrates it. The one that's mentioned in Ezekiel is this extremely large complex, and it's talked about as being the millennial temple. So that would be the fourth one. Did anyone hear about Israel? Train line from the airport to the temple western wall that will be completed prior to Passover of next year. I hadn't heard about it. I need to keep up on those things anyway. A good person that would be a good to keep up on that kind of stuff would be Amir. And with that in mind, let me open this up. Telegram is one of the few things that is somewhat censorship resistant anyway. And right now they're saying they don't care, what you say, well, to a point. But anyway, here's like our BibleFacts.org is when I post stuff. It's a channel, and then there's a communications thing with it, so we can talk about stuff. And then I've got stuff for our Tuesday night Bible study and those things. But I've also got Amir Sephardi, his channel, and he's always got lots and lots of good information. I usually get beeped 5 or 10 times a day, it seems like. There's lots of information, but he would be a good person to follow on that too. You can also follow us also. And actually to get here, if we go to BibleFacts.org and just go down to Telegram, that should actually open you up to there, and that's the stuff that we post. And then of course you can open it up in Telegram and be able to do lots of other stuff. So so I hadn't heard of that though. And then our last question is that when the Antichrist appears, when they start to sacrifice at the new temple. I don't know. Most of us think that the construction of the temple is part of the peace plan, which is the one that the Antichrist does. So that would be, if that's the case, the Antichrist would appear, create a peace plan, the 7-year covenant, and start on that. And then they would have permission to build the temple. Then they would build it, start the sacrifices. And in the middle of that 7-year period, the sacrifices would be stopped by him. That's the way most of us see it. I don't know if that's absolutely correct or not. Because right now they would like to build a temple, but the Sanhedrin and the people that run it, the basic idea is that they have to be given the Temple Mount by the person or the government that controls it. Right now it's disputed. So politically, there has to be a time, I don't know if you pay money or conquer the other people or whatever, but when all the nations around there agree that Israel owns the Temple Mount and it's their sovereign place, then if the nation of Israel, the government, says we're going to hand the running of the Temple Mount over to the priests, then the priests would go ahead and build a temple and start sacrificing. So that's kind of what they're waiting on. It's a political problem keeping them all back. And that's interesting if you think about it. It takes a war of some sort, or politics to change, and we understand in the near future we're going to have the destruction of Damascus is given in Isaiah 17. The destruction of Iran is given in Jeremiah 49. The Psalm 83 war. There's several other things actually. Israel taking the southern Lebanon, which is part of the Obadiah and Zephaniah prophecies. So there's a lot of prophecies that happen, but that happen sometimes. So we're not sure exactly what it goes. If all of those happen, say like in the next year or two, and then Israel becomes a superpower, which some people think will happen, then we could have a time when they are in total control, build their temple, start their stuff, and then maybe later on we have a 7-year tribulation. So it could actually come either way.